Let's start with a dangerous question. Is Magna Carta a fraud? Is it a swindle? Is it not what it seems at all? Consider the facts. It's revered all over the world today as the most ancient and hallowed beacon of justice and freedom from oppression. Sorry, excuse me, I just realized I've not done my technical bit. Can everybody hear me okay now? Right, consider the facts. It's revered all over the world as the most hallowed and ancient beacon of justice and freedom from oppression. But if we take a closer look at the document that the English King John was forced to agree by his barons back in 1215, we soon discover that it actually did next to nothing for 85% of the population who remained agricultural slaves. And worse, it actually cut back the limited rights that women had. And here's a shock for you. It's called the Magna Carta, the Great Charter, only because it was actually inscribed on a piece of parchment that was a bit smaller than another charter at the same time. So what is this all about? Have we all made a terrible mistake turning up here this morning at this beautiful law school to commemorate this document? But before you all slink out and cancel your subscriptions to the ABA, I'd just like you to consider the words of that great 17th century English jurist that Liz mentioned, Sir Edward Coke. Magna Carta, Coke said, is such a fellow that he will have no sovereign. 2 points here. First of all, it has no sovereign. What Coke meant by that was that it recognizes no superior, not even a king. But what I like about Coke's remark is this word fellow. It makes out Magna Carta to be a kind of regular guy. And it's true that Magna Carta is, and always has been, rather like a living being. Now, 800 years ago, back in 1215, it was like many a newborn in the Middle Ages. It was very lucky to survive into infancy. It had no qualities that looked like they were going to give it a long and healthy life. But Magna Carta had a sturdy heart, and over 800 years it grew up, if you like, and it changed to become a champion. And over the next few minutes we're going to look at that amazing, dramatic life story. So let's just remind ourselves first of all of some basic facts about Magna Carta. Back in 1215 there were a group of English barons who were in armed conflict against the English King John. The two sides figured that they'd better negotiate a peace. It was actually not much more than a stalling tactic. They knew it was going to come to an all-out civil war. So they met at Runnymede, which is a meadow on the banks of the Thames, as you probably know. It's about 4 miles to the west of Heathrow Airport. And then the Archbishop of Canterbury, well, he did a kind of Henry Kissinger. He shuttled back and forth between the two sides and he negotiated a deal. And the terms of that deal were then recorded in Magna Carta, which was agreed by the king. So that is it. If you go much beyond there, then you get into an area which is shrouded in myth and misunderstanding. So let's get a few of those out of the way first of all. These are the common myths. First of all, that King John was an evil, unredeemed tyrant. Secondly, that the barons were a united force representing the interests of the whole of the English nation. Then there's Magna Carta. It's often said that it's the birth of modern democracy, that it's the first constitution, and that it gave us equality under the law. So just have a look at these one by one. Was King John an evil tyrant? Well, actually, historians today have got a much more nuanced opinion of him. It was the Victorians who started this, or in fact, it was much before that. It was the only journalists of the day back in the 13th century who were the monks. And they were definitely on the side of the barons, and they were not above making up a lot of stories about him. The Victorians swallowed them whole. They said that King John was so foul, he would even befoul hell itself. Can you think of anything more damning than that? But today, historians reject that. He certainly wasn't a plaster saint, and he wasn't the sort of guy you want to sit next to at a dinner party. But he was full of contradictions. If anything, his worst crime was that he was unpredictable. He could turn against people very quickly. But you have to remember something, that if you were a monarch back in the 13th century, if you showed signs of weakness, you'd be overthrown very quickly. We mustn't judge King John, as ever, people in our past, by the standards of our own day. King John, no plaster saint and a complex guy, not an unredeemed tyrant. Then there are the barons. You see this picture here that I've got. This is actually a Victorian image painted by Sir Edward Normand. And you see these barons here, straight back, look you in the eye, honest Joes, and the king looks a bit shifty. This is what the Victorians thought. Actually, the barons weren't quite like that. Historians today regard the barons who rebelled against King John as a bunch of self-serving thugs. There were 170 great families back in 1215. Of those, only 40 were in rebellion against the king. And here's a surprise. Actually, there were another 40 who took up arms in defense of the king. And there were 70 barons who had nothing to do with either side. A rather different story. Okay, then there's Magna Carta itself. Was it the birth of modern democracy? Not unless you really stretch the meaning of the word democracy. It's nothing to do with politics. It doesn't challenge the king's right to rule. Is it the first constitution? It has nothing to do with defining the mechanics of government. And nor back in 1215 was it a document which was unchangeable for all time. Did it give us equality beneath the law? Well, this is a bit trickier, really. You'll see in a moment when we look at it, it didn't strictly do that, but it had some promising signs about it, so we won't cross it out. But we still, despite everything that I'm saying, rightly are here celebrating Magna Carta. You'll be pleased to know this, incidentally. You've not wasted your time. We're rightly celebrating Magna Carta as the foundation of freedom under the law. Let's take a look at the document, shall we? Here it is, as Liz pointed out. There were 13 of them. There's no one Magna Carta. It was written out 13 times and then was taken under armed guard to all the cathedral cities of England to be read out. It is a piece of parchment. Parchment, incidentally, is a bit of sheepskin which was soaked in lime and then scraped. The words were written on it in abbreviated medieval Latin, in soot mixed with a natural acid. It's about the size of the front page of the New York Daily News, turned on its side. It's not very impressive when you look at it. But, of course, that's not the end of the story. Magna Carta, what was it? Well, first of all, there is no statement of principle in it at all. There is nothing that says that the king must always behave in the best interests of his subjects, for instance, or we're all equal under the law. There's nothing like that at all in it. It has a total of 63 clauses. 12 of them tackle abuses by the king and his officials. For instance, if a sheriff comes along and decides that he wants your horse and cart, Magna Carta says, in future, he must compensate you. And the king must give back castles, for instance, to those that he's confiscated from his barons. 19 clauses close loopholes in the feudal system, the way in which England was governed, and so was most of Europe at this time. Very complex hierarchical system of government with very strange, obscure rules to us today. And that dealt with rules of inheritance, what a widow should do, etc., etc. Not very interesting to those of us who are not specialist medieval historians. 15 of them tidy up, I put it in quotes, the legal processes. The most scandalous of these, and I'm always one with an eye for scandal, is a clause which says that no man may be arrested or imprisoned on the say-so of a woman, except for the murder of her husband. That is a reduction in the rights of women in Magna Carta. Pretty shocking, huh? 6 of them try to regulate the markets. They actually set, for instance, a a standard measure for beer. I mean, you can't help but admire their ambition. There was absolutely no bureaucracy to be able to impose this at all. And 8 of them were simply rewarded the Baron's allies, the City of London, for instance, and the King of Scotland. So you can see that what we really have here is a ragbag of measures which are designed to deal with some very specific problems that were encountered in the year 1215. So why are we celebrating this? The thing is that if we, even when that moment arises, when we search through it and we find a clause that we say, that's one that really makes my freedom-loving heart leap, historians step in and pour cold water on it. Take clause 39. This is the most famous clause in Magna Carta. No freeman shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions or outlawed or exiled or deprived of his standing in any other way. Nor will we, that's the king, remember the royal we, kings always refer to themselves as we, and this is the king agreeing to this. Nor will we, the king, proceed with force against him or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. Stirring stuff, huh? Well, not quite. Free man. As I said earlier, in fact, the first thing is it excludes all women. But the other point is that free men constituted around about 1 in 4 of the population of England at that time. So what this looks like is upper-class men looking after themselves. That's what it is. But what about this? Except by the lawful judgment of his equals. Surely that's trial by jury. Actually, it isn't. What historians now know is that this was a very limited measure which was taken whenever there was a dispute about which court had jurisdiction. It's got nothing to do with trial by jury, and it's not the forerunner of trial by jury. So there's got to be something going for us in this, and indeed there is. This is the sturdy heart of Magna Carta. The most important thing you have here is that this is an example of the king agreeing that he will obey the law. And that is a first, and it's very important. Magna Carta doesn't say the king is beneath the law, but it gives examples of the way in which the king concedes that he has to obey the law. Very, very important. And the second point about Clause 39 is that if we accept for one moment that this applies to only a limited number of the people in the population, in which we have to do that, it is the thin end of the wedge. It establishes a principle that arbitrary punishment is wrong. Those who govern us may not harm us or punish us in any way other than by the law of the land. That principle is established here, even though it is not universal at this stage. So let us take a look at a couple of other clauses as well, which are really quite interesting. How about this one, Clause 40? To no one will we, the king again, sell, to no one will we deny or delay right or justice. Now what this looks like is the barons saying, well, you know, this is an example of the tyranny of the king. Actually, it's not that at all. You have to go back to King John's father, King Henry II. He reformed the legal process. He was an extremely intelligent and very energetic king. In the century before John, criminal trials, and indeed civil trials too, paid almost no regard at all to evidence, to facts on the ground. It's extraordinary for us today. They were largely based on superstition. So to give you an example, the most common way in which you would be tried if you were accused of a crime would be that you would be taken along to a very large lake somewhere. A priest would bless the water. You'd then be trussed and bound hand and foot, and you'd be thrown in. If you sank, presumably because your lungs filled with water, you were innocent. If you floated gaily on the water, you were guilty, because God had actually, was within the water that had been blessed, was rejecting you. Pretty horrific way of trying guilt or innocence. And there were various other methods that were used. John's father, Henry II, began to introduce a system which was more fact-based, which was more evidential. It wasn't a revolution overnight. And he did it for two reasons. One, his coronation oath said that he should protect his people. But secondly, he obeyed a well-known saying in the Middle Ages, which was Justitia magnum emolumentum est, which is roughly translated as the law is a good way to bring in the cash. I'm sure, Dean Allard, that this is not something which is well known within the BLS, but I thought I'd better tell you. So that's why he did it. What the barons are doing here is that they're saying, actually, we really like this new system of royal justice, but we actually think it should be tidied up. It should be faster, justice should be. Oh, and what's more, we don't want to pay for it anymore. So that's all that this is about. But it had a long, as you can imagine with words like that, it had a long pedigree that followed later. And here's another one, Clause 12. No scutage, it's a feudal tax, scutage. In feudalism, if you were a baron, then you owed so many days of night service a year to the king. But increasingly what was happening was that got commuted into a payment. It was called scutage. No scutage may be levied in our kingdom without its general consent. Don't be misled by general consent, by the way. That didn't mean you held a referendum every time you wanted to impose scutage. All it meant was the barons, those 170 families. It wasn't general consent at all. So what we have here is something which is very, very limited to the way in which feudalism operated. But it later turned into a general principle. And it was to re-emerge in the United States 550 years later. Okay, so Magna Carta, as I said, in 1215, wasn't much more than a stalling tactic. The Pope intervened, and he condemned it as being a shameful, degrading, illegal, and unjust. It wasn't because he objected to the terms, it was because King John had been very clever. What he'd done was that he had pledged his allegiance to the Pope, and he'd promised to go on crusade. So the Pope regarded him as being God's representative on earth. And God's representative on earth certainly couldn't be limited by the hoi polloi of the barons or anyone else at all. So he condemned it. And he actually excommunicated 30 barons who tried to implement it. The rebel barons themselves shifted their allegiance away from John to a French prince, who then invaded England, and full-scale civil war soon broke out. They rejected the mechanism of trying to solve their differences with a charter. It was back to the sword and crossbow. And Magna Carta was as good as dead within 3 months, and it would have stayed that way. It might well have stayed that way and gone to the dusty vaults of libraries somewhere of no interest to anyone other than a few medieval scholars, if it had not been for one happening, for one thing, a piece of dirty fish. Yeah. 16 months after Magna Carta, King John was at a place called Lynn. It's Lynn near Boston is named after it. And he ate a meal there, and the dirty fish gave him dysentery. And within 10 days, he was dead. And his death breathed new life into Magna Carta. The reason was that his heir, Henry III, was aged only 9 years old. Now, Henry III was described at the time as being a pretty little knight. These are not really the words you want to hear if you're in the middle of a civil war and you're facing a foreign invasion. You don't want to be led by a pretty little knight. However, this man, perhaps our first hero of Magna Carta, intervened. His name was William Marshall. He was probably the finest warrior of his day. If jousting had been an Olympic event, he would have got gold. And he was also very, very canny. He was very wise. And he decided that he had to do something to ease the transition of this very young king. And what he did was that he reissued Magna Carta. He changed it a little bit, and he reissued it. And it did the trick. The barons decided that they'd give the new king a chance. And meanwhile, William Marshall, incidentally, paid off the French prince, and he went back to Paris. But it was very important what happened here, because it set a pattern. And over the next 200 years, whenever kings decided that they wanted to raise cash, or whenever they faced rebellion amongst their subjects, they were forced to make concessions. And the concessions were always incorporated into a revised Magna Carta. Magna Carta was actually reissued at least 55 times, usually with changes to it during that first 100 years or so. And some of the changes were really quite significant. For instance, in 1297, this was added, that any decision taken by a judge or royal official which is at odds with Magna Carta shall be undone and holden for naught. This is a move towards making Magna Carta into something like a constitution. And here's another important one 3 years later. Instead of being issued in Latin, it was issued in English, so the common person could understand it. Very important. Perhaps the most important change, the most fundamental one, came in 1354 under Edward III. And our famous Clause 39 at that stage was changed. So it now read, you remember before it said no free man, which is only 1 in 4 of the male population. It now said no man of whatever estate or condition he may be shall be punished except by due process of law. Two things to look at here. First of all, that if we accept just for one moment that in the middle of the 14th century it still was not thinkable that they would have included women, we've got something which is well on the way to being a universal right here. And the second one is this wonderful phrase, due process of law. That's the origin of due process of law, the 1354 Magna Carta. The next great changes to Magna Carta came during the 17th century, during the great clash between Parliament and the King. And the Stuart kings, that's James I and Charles I, there was a war of ideas between the two. As well as that, of course, it led to our own English Civil War. It led to the dictatorship of Oliver Cromwell. But it was this war of ideas which really, if anything, changed the constitution, the constitutional makeup of England. It wasn't what happened on the battlefield. And that war of ideas was conducted like this. The Stuart kings claimed a divine right to rule. In other words, that they'd received their power directly from God, and that there was no way in which that power could be limited or influenced in any way by their own subjects. That posed a great difficulty for Parliament, because Parliament really needed to find something almost biblical in its power to rebut the claim of the Stuart kings. And the man who came forward at this point was the one that Liz mentioned earlier, Sir Edward Coke. He was the Lord Chief Justice. He was described as being brutal and arrogant. And I've always thought that this is probably just the sort of qualities that you need if you have to take on kings who claim that they get their power from God. He incidentally also was thrown into prison by the king for 7 months when he was in his early 70s. And he came out fighting. He was described as the toughest man that England ever knew. And he's our second hero of Magna Carta. So where could he find something that was so ancient and so hallowed to try and defeat the Stuart kings? Well, he turned, of course, to Magna Carta. And what he did was that he decided that the 1215 Magna Carta was the foundation, was the origin of trial by jury and habeas corpus. We now know that he was completely wrong about that. Modern historians know that that is not the case. And as I've already pointed out, for instance, trial by jury, that phrase in there was not trial by jury at all. It doesn't matter, and it didn't matter that he was wrong. It was an innocent mistake. In the 17th century, they didn't have the knowledge that we have of the way in which society was built at that time. And his interpretation of Magna Carta came to rule the day after that. That became the absolute last word in Magna Carta. Edward Coke did not live long enough to see perhaps the most dramatic result of his arguments. That came in 1649, when King Charles I was put on trial. It happened in Westminster Hall. If you've never been to Westminster Hall, the next time you're in London, I strongly advise you to see it. It's the most magnificent place. It's been there, it was already 100 years old by the time King John came to the throne. And it was there that King Charles was put on trial. There's an irony here. He couldn't be tried by a jury of his peers because kings have no peers. So he was tried by 68 judges. And the charge was that he was a tyrant, traitor, and murderer, and a public and implacable enemy to the Commonwealth of England. He was found guilty, of course. And then, on a cold January morning, he was allowed to walk his little dog for the last time in St. James's Park, just down the road from Westminster. And then he was brought back to face the crowds there. At the last minute, the executioner backed out, and they had to bring in a reserve axeman at the incredible fee of £100. And he chopped off King Charles's head and held it up. We then reach a point in the history of Magna Carta when once again it might have completely disappeared. Because what happened in England was that increasingly from this point onwards, Magna Carta faded into the background. And it was Parliament and it was the burgeoning court system that increasingly came to be regarded as the guarantee of English freedoms, of English justice, not Magna Carta. And Magna Carta became increasingly forgotten in England. However, the 17th century was also the age of colonization, when small ships were going across to this place where we are now. And in 1607, 3 small ships carried 104 men, they were all men, across to Jamestown. And in their little ships, not only did they carry muskets and plowshares and Bibles, they also took with them Magna Carta. Not the physical parchment, but the ideas that it represented as interpreted by Sir Edward Coke. And Coke wrote the Jamestown Charter. And the last words of that charter were this: every person and their children shall have and enjoy all liberties, franchises, and immunities to all intents and purposes if they had been abiding and born within this realm of England. That was taken to mean that the English common law and Magna Carta, as interpreted by Coke, applied in North America. However, there was a problem. The journey from Jamestown or any of the other parts of the colonies back to England and back to Jamestown again could take anything up to a year. So it was hardly prompt justice. So what happened over the next 150 years was that the 13 colonies, increasingly, they had this need, therefore, to create, if you like, a local sovereign. And so increasingly, the 13 colonies decided that they would have their own individual constitutions. And all of them, to a greater or lesser extent, turned to Magna Carta in order to give some real ancient force to what they were doing. For instance, the Maryland Charter stated that all its citizens shall not be imprisoned nor deceased. Deceased is dispossessed, or dispossessed of their freehold goods or chattels, or be outlawed, exiled, or otherwise destroyed, forejudged, or punished, except according to the laws of this province. So you recognize it's Clause 39 of Magna Carta once again. And just to give you an example as well, this is the seal of Massachusetts. You may be familiar with it. And not only is he holding a sword in one hand, if you look very closely there, he's holding Magna Charta, it says. So it's hardly surprising then that when it came to 1776, and the issue was not the individual rights of the citizens of the colonies, but the status of the whole of that colony, that they turned to Magna Carta. Magna Carta justified at this point the independence of a whole nation. The tyrant now was the very king and the parliament that people in England regarded as being their savior, but it was regarded as being the tyrant. And of course, as you well know, the great slogan of that time was no taxation without representation. And that is, you remember we looked at that clause which said no scutage. That had been interpreted by Coke as meaning that no tax at all, without general consent. So nothing to do with the barons, nothing to do with feudalism. So that was a misinterpretation, but it now became used. That clause, Clause 12, now appears in the United States. And when this country then got its independence, in the early days, when the Constitution was written, something was almost forgotten in all of the turmoil of the early events, and that was how the rights of the individual citizens was going to be protected. And of course, that was the Bill of Rights. And we now come to the third, I believe, the third great hero of Magna Carta, James Madison. James Madison was apparently a very shy man, not at all like Donald Trump, perhaps. He was also in frail health, but he was a man of steely determination. And once he became convinced of the need for something to protect the rights of the individual citizens, it was said that he then hounded relentlessly his fellow congressmen until they agreed the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. The most important of those was this, the end of the Fifth Amendment, as far as we're concerned. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So you'll notice due process of law. That's lifted from the 1354 Magna Carta. And you'll notice, too, that it says no person. Now it's not no man of whatever estate, no free man. It's now no person. But as you may well be very well aware, this phrase, no person, has faults to it. The Bill of Rights, it was said, was an engine that wouldn't start. No person, unfortunately not. Men without property found it difficult in that early stages to take advantage of this great clause. And of course, 50% of the population, women, tended in practice to be excluded. So did Native Americans who were not citizens in their own land. And so did, of course, 600,000 black slaves. And in the middle of the 19th century, the Supreme Court even ruled that blacks have no rights, which the white man is bound to respect. The words of Magna Carta quoted in the Bill of Rights, it took another 200 years or more, the bloodiest civil war, the bloodiest war that humankind has ever seen, more amendments, the civil rights movement, the women's suffrage movement, and all of those minority movements. It took a long time before the words of Magna Carta, as reflected in the Bill of Rights, came to be effective. But after the Civil War, the courts did increasingly uphold the principles in the Bill of Rights. Over 900 court decisions have referred to Magna Carta for guidance. The reason being, of course, that whenever they needed to understand what was in the minds of the Founding Fathers, they were inevitably led back to Cook's interpretation of Magna Carta. And Magna Carta has been cited, for instance, to clarify the meaning of the words due process, on the need for speedy and public trial, in support of trial by jury and unbiased judges, against excessive fines, against cruel and unusual punishment, and most of all, of course, in civil liberties cases. One of the earliest ones in the 1940s, when death sentences against 4 black youths were overturned after it was found that they had been brutalized and terrorized in a prison cell, and it was Magna Carta that was used to relieve them of that death penalty. Over 100 of these cases have been in the Supreme Court itself. Perhaps the most famous of them, certainly in the popular mind, came in the 1990s with the occupant of this building, when Bill Clinton found himself facing allegations of sexual harassment from Paula Jones. Now, Clinton's lawyers argued that he ought not to face trial, he ought not to stand in a court of law while he was president, because that would distract him from the important job of being president of the United States. However, a federal district judge stated, "It is contrary to our form of government, which asserts, as did the English in the Magna Carta, that even the sovereign is subject to God and the law." This was Magna Carta, which was being used as more than a symbol. It had almost brought down a president. Clinton found himself in the same boat as King John. But unlike King John, who couldn't manage to get all the most important magnates of the day on his side, Bill Clinton did. Of course, the Democrat majority in the Senate meant that the impeachment failed. Magna Carta today has a life beyond the courts. I love this image, by the way. It's of a senior citizens rally against big government in a Florida street protest. Professor Hasseltine, historian, has said this: the history of Magna Carta in America has a meaning far deeper than the influence of a single constitutional document. Its spirit is inherent in the aspirations of the race. I asked myself, what did he mean by the aspirations of the race? And I believe it is that Magna Carta is important in the United States because it's seen as the most hallowed and ancient bastion against tyranny. Now, no free nations wish to be ruled by a dictator, by a tyrant. But it seems to me that there is something in the United States, something that makes this extra important. And I've searched for why this is, because this country has never had its Stalin or its Hitler. But it seems to me that the reason, and sorry, this is an illustration, in fact, of the early importance of this. This is the flag of Virginia, and it has a picture of virtue standing on the breast of a defeated tyranny. And underneath are the words Sic semper tyrannis, which were the words used by Brutus when he assassinated Caesar, who was regarded, of course, as a tyrant. And it's roughly translated as, thus perish all tyrants. So why is it that the defense against tyranny is so important in the United States? Well, part of the reason, I think, is historical, because the birth of the nation was seen to be a battle against the tyranny of London, the king, and Parliament. But also, I believe that it's partly cultural, and that the American dream, that ideal, which, like all ideals, falls short often in practice, the ideal that even a baby born in a log cabin can become president or can become a millionaire. And the qualities which were forged in places like Jamestown and the early colonies, those qualities of self-reliance and the worth of the individual, are considered to be cramped by any overmighty government and would be killed stone dead by an absolute dictator. So Magna Carta in the US today permeates many, many different sectors of life, as well as in the courts. It's taught in schools' curricula, as you know, in high schools and in colleges and in universities. It surfaces in congressional debates. I see that quite recently there was an attack on President Obama for allegedly abusing the executive fiat, and Magna Carta was cited as part of that attack. And in newspaper columns too, especially we've seen it recently, there have been a slew of opinion pieces in newspapers about Guantanamo Bay and the illegal imprisonment of the terrorists there. So Magna Carta has had a long life. If we look at this particular phrase from the Bill of Rights, from the Fifth Amendment, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, which, remember, is Magna Carta. If we regard the words due process as being a use of Magna Carta, then there is barely a second goes by in the United States but that someone isn't using Magna Carta to complain about their boss when he threatens to fire them, to object to a parking fine, or to challenge some over-officious bureaucrat. Magna Carta started life as little more than the manifesto of a few 13th century noblemen. It's gone from that to being the watchword of Middle America. So over the years, over 8 centuries, Magna Carta has come to be regarded as the ancient and hallowed record of rights so fundamental that they have the force of morality itself. The Great Charter reflects two things which define the nature of civilized society: the need for fairness and security. And what Magna Carta teaches us is that those who govern us are subject to the law like the rest of us. And it's not permitted for them to punish us or to harm us in any way other than by due process. But remember this, Magna Carta can do nothing on its own. In order to work, it requires legislators to enact fair laws. It requires judges to be independent. It requires lawyers to remember that justice and fairness are not always the same thing. And it requires every one of us to continue to fight in the name of Magna Carta. Dean Allard, I thank you for... Dean Allard, I thank you for honouring an Englishman with the invitation to make this keynote speech. It seems to me that that is appropriate, because when we English sent that fellow called Magna Carta across in a little ship to Jamestown in 1607, it was perhaps my country's greatest gift to the people of America. Thank you. Sure.
I was just wondering how the regent was chosen of the 9-year-old king.
Not by any democratic process at all. William Marshall is a fantastic character. He really is in every way. He had arguments with King John, and King John threatened at one stage to put him on trial. But William Marshall was of the old school, and for him, loyalty to king trumped everything. It didn't matter how bad your king was, he remained loyal to him. And he was, as I said, he was not only a brilliant warrior, but he was a very, very wise man. And he was regarded as the most important, purely because of his talents, the most important in the royalist camp. So when John died, it was automatic that he would become the regent. He was an immensely powerful and influential character.
Your 1776 map showing Quebec showed it extending over past the Great Lakes. Do you have an explanation for that?
I don't, I'm afraid. I'm awfully sorry. I freely acknowledge that I lifted the map, I'm afraid, from what I thought was a reputable source. Do you think that's inaccurate? Is it inaccurate, do you think?
It's inaccurate.
Is it? Thank you for telling me. I shall change that. Thank you.
Speak briefly to the influence of the Magna Carta in Britain today? Because I've heard that it has much more weight in America than it does in England.
Yeah, exactly, it does. This is one of the many fascinating things. I mean, I talked at the beginning about all the myths and misunderstandings about Magna Carta. One of the things that I often do when I'm doing this talk, but I thought I wouldn't do it here because I think you all know, if I'm with an English audience, I show the memorial at Runnymede, the wonderful memorial there, and then I say, do you know what? This was actually built on a subscription by 9,000 lawyers. You know, they weren't barristers from the Middle Temple. They weren't solicitors from England. Every last one of them was American. And all the audience in England go, what? Oh, my goodness. And it is true that really once the bloodless revolution of 1689 in England had happened, parliamentary democracy rose very rapidly, and so did the courts. And it really... there is a fundamental difference, I think, between our two countries. And others will know more about this than I do. But over here, the idea that you would have a piece of paper, a piece of parchment, which can be referred to, I think in some ways maybe reflects a kind of distrust of Washington, distrust of people who can be corrupted. You can't corrupt a constitution. The words are there. And so that's terribly important. So pieces of parchment, pieces of paper are very important on this side of the Atlantic. Strangely enough, that's not the case in the UK. In the UK, we regard elective democracy. I'm not saying that elective democracy is not important in the US, clearly it is. But there is no tradition from 1689 onwards of pieces of paper of us needing to look to them. Funnily enough, this is now being reflected in the arguments which are taking place, which you're probably aware of, between the UK and Europe at the moment. There's great resistance in Europe to increasing, for us to become increasingly part of the European Federation. And part of the reason for that is the very thing that I'm talking about, is in that Europe tends to look to constitutions, to what I think Madison called parchment barriers, whereas there's no tradition of that now in England. It doesn't mean to say that we have no interest in it, we do, but it's more as a historic thing rather than as something which is living today. If it hadn't been brought to America, I don't think we would even be celebrating it, to be honest, really. I mean, it does appear, and it is important in many of the former English colonies, of course, in India and Australia and Canada, of course, as well. But nowhere as important as it is in the US. It just has this resonance with the need for parchment barriers, as Madison called them. I mean, it has appeared in England since then. The Chartist movement, for instance, which was a movement which represented working people back in the early 19th century. It's called the Chartists because they looked to Magna Carta. But does that sort of answer your question? It's a rather rambling answer, but it's a fascinating topic.
We have in the audience, who will be speaking at lunch and maybe touching some of these issues, Prime Minister Cameron's constitutional advisor,
right.
Michael Pinto.
Yes, of course.
So
yes.
Maybe we'll get to that. So I'm going to wrap up with two particular questions. One, tell us what happened. You mentioned the bad piece of fish, but tell us what happened and why we should all rush out with metal detectors to King John's wealth, which he traveled and carried with him. And then after you send us off on that, how does Robin Hood fit along?
Wonderful. Okay, well, when King John ate this bad piece of fish and became very ill, there's an area of eastern England called the Wash. It's a big bay. And Lynn is on this side of it. And he needed to get round to the other side. And despite the fact that he was in a bad way with the dysentery, he set off on the journey. But kings, you have to remember at this time, in fact, didn't live in a palace. They traveled all the time. It was the only way in which they could rule their kingdoms. They had to show themselves with an army constantly all over the country. So he needed to travel north. Civil war was raging. He sent his baggage train on a short cut across the sand flats, the mud flats of the Wash. Now, when I say baggage train, don't just think of a few, I don't know, plastic bags or something. The baggage train consisted not only of his mobile chapel, all his mobile furniture, but it also was all of the crown jewels. And not only the crown jewels, but also his grandmother, whose name was Matilda, had apparently the most extraordinary set of jewels, which she had inherited from her forebears. And there was, for instance, a golden wand with a golden dove on the top. There was the golden sword of Tristram. Enormous amount of stuff. Anyway, it was an October morning, and they set off across the mudflats. If you go to that area today, you can see why it would happen. There are no landmarks at all. And if you don't have a guide, it would be very easy to get lost, especially on a misty morning, which that was. And the baggage train got into trouble, really serious trouble. The horses were sucked down. The horse and carts were sucked down. The men tried to get it out. Men lost their lives doing it. And it disappeared into the mud. And apparently when John got the news at the end of the day, when he'd reached the other side of the Wash and news was brought to him of what had happened, his fever shot up, it was said, as well it might. And if you ever want to become a billionaire, then maybe you would like to go to a metal detector around the Wash to see if you can find it, because it's never been found. Part of the problem is that a lot of the land has been reclaimed, and it's now somewhere about 6 miles inland, underneath some field. But it's never been found, and historians have looked into this and thought, well, maybe it was a story that somebody made up. But we are 99.9% certain that all of this regalia and jewelry was all lost. Robin Hood. Okay, I come from Nottingham, so I know all about Robin Hood. I was a fan of as a boy, of the soccer team there called Nottingham Forest, and whenever we went to see the game, in fact, before it started, they used to play over the loudspeaker, Robin Hood, riding through. I know, because I know it well. Okay, I think actually all the legends about Robin Hood have got quite a lot to owe, in fact, to a guy from California. That's true. There was a play that was written around the early part of the 20th century, which was just called Runnymede, and which portrayed Robin Hood as a leader of outlaws who robbed the rich to give to the poor, and who was on the side of the wonderful Richard the Lionheart. Actually, we've rewritten the history of Richard the Lionheart, by the way. He's not a hero anymore. Apparently in the play that was written, King John is eventually executed on the say-so of Robin Hood. And the truth is, of course, that Robin Hood probably never existed. There may have been somebody like that. Forest, you have to remember that much of England, probably at least 3/4 of England, was covered in forest at that time. And if you were, it's like the Wild West, or the Florida Everglades. If you were an outlaw and you wanted to escape the law, that's where you went into the forest. It was much more difficult to track you down. All of the things that we traditionally believe that we know about Robin Hood being representing the people and overcoming King John is actually all a bunch of baloney, I'm afraid. But it's a wonderful story. I often think, actually, that there's a great book to be written about popular outlaws, from Robin Hood through to Bonnie and Clyde, really. Yeah.
So that's your next book. But with respect to this book, Darren, first of all, you did the impossible. You combined more than the 4 lectures I heard into one. And you've given us a glimpse of the golden thread of truth about Magna Carta. If you liked his lecture, which was impossible not to like, you're going to love his book, most recent book, Magna Carta in 20 Places. It is not only incredibly informative, but what comes through is your absolute joy in your pursuit of the history and your sleuthing and tramping around these 20 sites, 14 in England, 4 in France, 2 in the United States. Mm-hmm. And it is also, I think, probably a travel log. This would be a great travel guide for somebody that wants to visit some interesting places in England, for example. So thank you for being, we're looking forward.
My great pleasure. Thank you, Nick.